The humble maid only wanted to pay her overdue bills. The millionaire needed a wife to avoid losing everything. But when she wore that simple outfit, he was left breathless. The contract turned into passion, and the improbable became love. What do you think will happen in this story? Comment and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The golden sunset painted the horizon of Park Avenue as Ethan Mitchell, 35, concluded another board meeting in his corporate penthouse. The emblematic CEO of Mitchell Innovations, the largest technology company in the United States, dismissed his executives with his habitual coolness. Finally alone, he loosened his Italian tie and contemplated the empire he had built in record time. 50 floors of glass and steel that rivaled the world's largest corporations, employing more than 5,000 employees and responsible for 30% of national technology exports. Ethan phone, announced Patricia, his secretary, for the 20th time that day. It's Mr. Harrington. He says it's urgent. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew exactly what this was about. 3 days ago, his grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, the family matriarch and his only reference of genuine affection, had departed this world. As the family lawyer for decades, Harrington was the bearer of the last wishes of the woman who had practically raised him after his parents' abandonment. Ethan, we need to talk in person about Eleanor's will, the lawyer said gravely, when he answered. There's a specific clause that requires immediate attention. 2 hours later, in the law office in Midtown, the young billionaire listened incredulously to Mr. Harrington's words as the fine rain began to blur the panoramic view of the city. Your grandmother stipulated that if you're not legally married, by the time you turn 36, you'll lose majority control of Mitchell Innovations and 70% of the inheritance that supports the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation's projects. Is this some kind of joke? Ethan stood up, his usually controlled face now contorted with indignation. My grandmother dedicated her life to teaching me about business, about how to build this empire. Why would she do this now? Mr. Harrington adjusted his glasses and removed a sealed envelope from his drawer. She left this for you. She asked that you read it when we were discussing this part of the will. With slightly trembling hands, Ethan opened the envelope. His grandmother's careful handwriting, whom he had missed so much during childhood when she traveled on business, but who always returned with stories and gifts, brought a lump to his throat. My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer there to see you grow even more. I know this last requirement of mine will seem cruel, but believe me, it's not about control or manipulation. Your grandfather Thomas was a brilliant businessman, but loneliness consumed him from within. He confused power with happiness and died without ever having known what it is to share life. I don't want that for you. The empire we built together will only make sense if there's real life in it. I'm not asking for just any marriage out of convenience. I'm asking you to open yourself to real possibilities. That's why I stipulated this clause, not as punishment but as a final gift. With eternal love, Grandma Eleanor. Ethan slowly folded the letter, his eyes fixed on the New York horizon, where lights were beginning to dot the growing darkness. How much time do I have? Your 36th birthday is in exactly 6 months. You need to be married by then. In the days that followed, news about the clause leaked in the company's inner circles. Soon, Ethan's routine was invaded by insinuations, invitations, and maneuvers of all kinds. Executives' daughters appeared without appointments. Business dinners mysteriously transformed into meetings with influential politicians' nieces. Even shareholders directly suggested suitable candidates for Mitchell Innovations' profile. During a lunch with his CFO, James Parker, at the luxurious restaurant atop the headquarters building, Ethan vented, "It's grotesque. Suddenly, I'm Maid, treated like some medieval prince who needs a consort. Yesterday, the Science and Technology Secretary's daughter practically offered herself as a corporate sacrifice." James, one of the few who knew Ethan since college, laughed discreetly. "Welcome to the world of crossed interests, my friend. But look on the bright side, you have options, many options." "Empty options," Ethan cut him off, observing the city below. People who see a position, not a person. You know what all these women have in common, James? They all already know exactly how they would decorate my house, how they would manage my social calendar, how they would use the Mitchell name. None have asked what I like to do on rare free mornings, or what kind of music calms me after a difficult day. His friend observed Ethan with curiosity. It was the first time in years he had seen him express something so personal. Since taking full command of the company at 29, Ethan had become almost an entity. The perfect executive, the impeccable strategist, the visionary leader. Few remembered that behind the business success was a man who had grown up practically alone, with absent parents, and a grandmother who, despite her love, was frequently immersed in business. Maybe your grandmother was right, James ventured. Maybe we all need something beyond reports and stocks. Ethan didn't respond. His gaze captured, through the glass separating the restaurant from the service area, an unusual scene. A young woman, dressed in the discreet uniform of the cleaning staff, was helping a waiter who had dropped a tray. While other employees hurried past, she had knelt down, collecting the pieces with an almost hypnotic tranquility, saying something that made the nervous waiter smile with relief. There was a dignity in her simple gestures that contrasted deeply with all the social theater he had witnessed in recent weeks. "Who is that employee?" he asked, more to himself than to James. The CFO followed his gaze, confused. "Which one? The cleaning staff?" "The one helping the waiter." "No idea, probably outsourced." "Why?" Ethan looked away, returning to his plate. "No reason, just observing how some people solve problems without turning them into dramas." That night, in his Upper East Side penthouse, Ethan opened the window to feel the warm New York breeze. 6 months. In 6 months, he could lose not only control of the company he had built, but also the funding for the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation's social projects, digital inclusion initiatives that brought technology and education to underprivileged communities throughout the country. Ironically, these projects were the only part of his empire for which he felt genuine personal pride. Not for the image return, but for a promise made to his grandmother years before, when they visited a school without computers in rural Pennsylvania. On the horizon, the city lights seemed blurred, or perhaps it was his eyes, suddenly moist as he remembered the words from the letter. "The empire we built together will only make sense if there's real life in it." For the first time in years, Ethan Mitchell realized that despite commanding one of the largest technology conglomerates in North America, he had no idea what a real life meant. Sophie Collins woke up before the alarm, as always. The small apartment in Queens was still dark when she prepared coffee and separated her mother's medications. Martha Collins, lying in the adjacent room, breathed with difficulty even in deep sleep. The advanced lupus required expensive and constant treatments that consumed almost all of Sophie's salary. "Mom, it's time for your medicine," she whispered, gently touching the woman's shoulder. Martha opened her eyes slowly, a tired smile forming when she saw her daughter. "Already leaving, my flower?" "In a little while. Coffee is ready and Mrs. Johnson is coming to stay with you today. I'll leave the food in the microwave, just press the button." While helping her mother take the pills, Sophie contemplated the face marked by time and disease. At 56, Martha looked much older, her body punished by years of work as a domestic helper and by the autoimmune disease that had forced her to retire early. But her eyes, those Sophie recognized, still held the same strength that had raised her alone after her father's abandonment. "Are you feeling better today?" she asked, stroking the grey hair. "Yes, I am," Martha lied, as she always did to not worry her daughter. "Yesterday's physical therapy helped a lot." Sophie knew it wasn't true. The health insurance had denied the latest authorization for intensive treatment. They would need to appeal again, a draining process that would require more money, more time, more energy they didn't have. At 5:30 a.m., Sophie was already at the bus stop. She had almost a 2-hour journey ahead to the business center of New Way, York City. She used the time to continue the book she was reading, a worn copy about economic anthropology she had bought at a used bookstore. With a degree in social sciences from Columbia University, Sophie had abandoned her master's program 5 years earlier, when her mother's diagnosis arrived. At the time, She had received a doctoral scholarship offer with research possibilities in France. Everything had been left behind. Now, at 32, she worked as a cleaning assistant at Mitchell Tower, the imposing headquarters of the country's largest technology company. Her official function was to clean the administrative floors, but her natural intelligence and education made her a sort of silent wild card. Sophie solved problems, calmed crises, and occasionally corrected grammatical errors in important reports she found on desks. Small anonymous contributions that no one ever realized came from the cleaning lady. "Good morning, Sophie," greeted Walter, the security guard who always arrived at the same time. "Good morning. I brought some cornbread that was left over at home," she replied, extending a small plastic container. "You're a real angel," smiled the man, storing the gift in his locker. "Heard the news about the boss?" Sophie raised her eyebrows, curious. Although naturally discreet, information was something she always valued. "What news?" "They say he needs to get married in 6 months, or he loses the company. Something about his grandmother's will. The executives are all excited, practically drawing lots to see who'll offer their daughter." Sophie smiled, shaking her head as she clocked in. "Sounds like something from a soap opera." "That's true, but the story is spreading. Just yesterday in the 48th floor meeting room, the whole board was discussing it. They were so entertained. They didn't even notice I was fixing the air conditioning. It seems to be true." After storing her belongings in the locker room, Sophie began her routine on the 45th floor. Ironically, the same one where CEO Ethan Mitchell's office was located. She had never met him personally, though she had cleaned his office dozens of times. She worked mainly when the executives had already left, moving like a shadow through the company's corridors of power. That morning, however, something different happened. As she passed the main corridor with her cleaning cart, Sophie saw the door to the meeting room open. Altered voices discussed business strategies. One stood out, firm, controlled, but with an underlying tension that captured her attention. "I won't sacrifice the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation projects because of market speculation. These programs are non-negotiable." Sophie slowed her pace, intrigued by the conviction in the man's voice. It was Ethan Mitchell, she realized, defending the company's social projects against cuts proposed by other executives. "Ethan, be reasonable," said another man with a condescending tone. "If you're really risking losing control because of this, crazy clause in the will. We need to cut non-essential costs now. You can resume philanthropy later." "Philanthropy?" Ethan's voice rose slightly. "What we do is not charity, it's social investment. Those digital schools are training the next generation of American programmers. It's our future, not a whim." Sophie stopped completely, forgetting for a moment that she shouldn't be listening. The passionate defense of social projects was unexpected, coming from the man the press painted as a corporate robot. "The bigger problem remains the deadline," a female voice intervened. 6 months is very little time to find a suitable wife and ensure the marriage is considered legitimate for the purposes of the will. "I thought we had already decided on Diana Castro. She has the political connections and the appropriate background," commented another executive. There was a heavy silence before Ethan responded. "We haven't decided anything about my personal life, and Diana Castro is more interested in parading with the Mitchell name than anything else." Realizing she had lingered too long, Sophie resumed her way, quickly pushing the cart away from the room. However, the conversation kept echoing in her mind throughout the day. The billionaire's situation was intriguing, not for the romantic dilemma, but for what it revealed about power structures and vulnerabilities hidden behind corporate facades. That night, upon returning home after her second shift at a diner in Brooklyn, Sophie found correspondence that would change everything. The health insurance had definitively denied the experimental treatment that could significantly improve her mother's quality of life. They would have to bear the full costs, $78,000. Martha was already asleep when Sophie sat at the small kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to find a mathematical solution to an impossible problem. Even with 2 jobs, even selling the only valuable asset they owned, her father's old car they never used, she wouldn't come close to the necessary amount. It was in this moment of silent desperation that the morning's overheard conversation returned to her mind. A billionaire who needed to get married in 6 months, a fortune at risk, social projects threatened. Sophie Collins wasn't a dreamer, she was a surviving strategist, trained not only by academia, but by the relentless school of necessity. With the methodical calm that characterized her, she opened her notebook and began to write. Not an emotional appeal, not a letter of supplication, a plan, a business proposal. 2 days later, after meticulously researching Ethan Mitchell's routine, Sophie discovered that he visited a specialized rare bookstore in the old downtown area alone every Wednesday. No one at the company knew about this habit. It was his only moment of privacy during the week. With her heart racing, but her face composed in its usual mask of serenity, Sophie waited outside the Argonaut bookstore that Wednesday. When Ethan emerged, a volume of poetry under his arm, she approached with the objectivity of someone who has nothing to lose. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Sophia Collins. I work on the cleaning staff of your corporate building. I have a business proposal that could solve your problem with your grandmother's will." Ethan stopped, surprised not only by the approach but by the recognition. Few would identify him outside the corporate environment without his traditional suit and tie. "How did you—" he began, but Sophie gently interrupted him. "Information is a resource like any other, Mr. Mitchell, and people like me tend to be invisible to people like you, which allows us to observe a lot." There was something in the woman's composure that intrigued him. She didn't seem nervous or desperate, as would be expected from someone in her social position approaching one of the most powerful men in the country. There was an almost aristocratic dignity in her bearing, despite her simple clothes and the evident fatigue on her face. "What kind of proposal?" he asked, against his better judgment. "One that will solve your time problem, ensure the maintenance of the social projects you value, and will be completely discreet and professional. May I explain further in a more suitable location?" Ethan hesitated only for a moment before indicating a discreet cafe at the end of the street. Something about this woman's objectivity intrigued him, and as he had learned in business, sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected places. The Belvedere Cafe was a small oasis of tranquility hidden among historic buildings in downtown New York. Ethan chose a secluded table near the window that overlooked an internal courtyard with a century-old tree. Few knew this place, one of his refuges when he needed to think without the constant pressure of the corporation. "So, Sophia Collins, what exactly is your proposal?" he asked as soon as the waiter moved away with their orders. An espresso for him, a chamomile tea for her. Sophie maintained direct eye contact, without intimidation or submission. "You need a wife to fulfill the clause in your grandmother's will. I'm willing to assume that role temporarily, with clear conditions and a formal agreement." Ethan couldn't contain an incredulous smile. "And what makes you think I would consider something like that?" "3 reasons," replied Sophie, enumerating with her fingers. "First, you're being harassed by candidates driven by evident social and financial interests, which clearly bothers you. Second, the deadline is running out, and the conventional options seem increasingly unsatisfactory. Third, I offer something none of them can offer: absolute transparency and absence of social pretensions." The businessman studied the woman before him with growing curiosity. There was an evident intelligence in her gaze, a precise articulation in her words that completely clashed with the initial image of a simple cleaning employee. "Why would you do this? What would you gain?" he asked, instinctively assuming his negotiator posture. Sophie took a deep breath. This was the critical moment. "My mother has advanced lupus. The health insurance denied a treatment that could significantly improve her quality of life. It costs $78,000. Additionally, I need financial stability to properly care for her in the coming years." The raw honesty of the response caught Ethan off guard. There was no drama, just the brutal objectivity of necessity. "I see. So it's money." "It's survival," Sophie corrected without altering her tone. "But I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering a solution to your problem in exchange for a solution to mine, A fair contract. The tea and coffee arrived, creating a pause in the tense conversation. Ethan observed how Sophie thanked the waiter with a genuine smile, the first she had shown since they began talking. It was a small gesture but revealing. "How exactly do you imagine this would work?" he asked after a sip of coffee. "A 1-year contract. Legal marriage with complete separation of assets. We would maintain separate residences, but I would appear at social and corporate events when necessary. At the end of the period, a discreet divorce. You keep your company, and I receive an amount that allows me to properly care for my mother. And if I manage to annul the clause in the will before that, we can stipulate early termination clauses. I'm flexible regarding the terms as long as my main objective is met." Ethan took another sip of coffee, buying time to process the unusual proposal. In his years of business, he had participated in billion-dollar negotiations, intercontinental mergers, and fierce corporate disputes, but never something so unexpectedly personal as this. "Why would I trust you? What guarantees me you're not? An opportunist seeking fame or a chance for future extortion?" Sophie placed her teacup on the table carefully. "You have resources to investigate my background. Do so. You'll discover I have an incomplete master's degree in social anthropology from Columbia University, that I refused a doctoral scholarship to care for my mother, and that I've worked 2 jobs for 5 years without any incident. As for the media, I have more to lose than gain from exposure. My life works better in the shadows." Something in the response struck Ethan. This woman had studied at the same university as him, probably with similar academic potential. Yet, while he built an empire, she cleaned the corridors he walked through. The paths of life and its privileges had never seemed so evident. "I'll consider your proposal," he finally said. "But first, I need to verify your information." "Understandable, here's my number," Sophie replied, sliding a paper across the table. "I'll await your contact." 3 days later, Ethan already knew everything about Sophia Collins. His security department had compiled a complete dossier. Born in the outskirts of New York. Full scholarship at the prestigious St. Anne's private school thanks to a program for exceptional talents. First place in Columbia University's social sciences admission exam. 2 articles published in scientific journals, praised by professors as a brilliant mind with extraordinary potential. Then, the rupture, her mother's diagnosis, the abandonment of her academic career, the multiple jobs, the growing medical debts, a trajectory of sacrifice and dignity. What most impressed Ethan, however, were the testimonies discreetly collected among Mitchell Tower employees. The security staff described her as a silent angel. Colleagues reported small acts of kindness, like teaching mathematics to a janitor's son during breaks, or covering shifts for colleagues with family problems without asking for anything in return. An invisible woman in the eyes of power, but deeply respected by her peers. In his penthouse apartment, Ethan stared at the folder with the information while rain battered New York outside. Sophia's proposal was logical, practical, and surprisingly the least complicated option among all he had considered. Even so, there was something uncomfortable about the idea, not because of the falsity of the arrangement, but because of the raw nakedness of the transaction. A marriage reduced to its practical components, without the romantic illusion that society demanded. Ironically, this brutal honesty was also the greatest attraction. With Sophie, at least he would know exactly where he stood. The next morning, he called the number she had left. "Can we meet tonight to discuss the terms?" he asked without preamble when she answered. "Yes," Sophie replied with the same objectivity. "Where and when?" "At my apartment. I would send a car, but I imagine you prefer to maintain discretion." "Correct, I'll be there at 8 p.m. When the doorbell rang punctually at 8 o'clock, Ethan realized he was nervous, an almost forgotten sensation for someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of executives and investors. Opening the door, he found Sophie wearing simple but well-kept clothes, dark jeans, a basic white shirt, and a navy blue blazer that seemed to have been carefully preserved for years. Her curly hair was tied in a practical bun, and her only accessory was a small necklace with a green stone pendant. Jade, Ethan recognized. "Welcome," he said, leading her to the spacious living room with a panoramic view of Central Park. Sophie observed the environment with analytical eyes, not with awe as would be expected, but with the methodical interest of someone studying a natural habitat. "I like your library," she commented, indicating the wall full of books that occupied an entire side of the room. Montesquieu next to Mark Twain. Interesting combination. Ethan smiled, genuinely surprised. "You know Montesquieu?" "The corruption of each government begins almost always with the corruption of principles," Sophie quoted naturally. "I studied quite a bit of political theory during undergraduate." For a brief moment, Ethan glimpsed the woman Sophia could have been, a respected academic, perhaps an influential intellectual, if fate hadn't intervened with her mother's illness. It was an alternative version of an interrupted life. "I prepared some documents for us to discuss," he said, refocusing on the meeting. "My lawyers drafted a preliminary contract based on the points you mentioned." On the coffee table, he organized several folders. "Here are the terms of the agreement, including financial compensation, public appearance schedule, and confidentiality conditions. And here," he pointed to another folder, "is the documentation for your mother's treatment. I've already arranged for full payment, regardless of your final decision about our partnership." Sophie looked at the folder with her mother's treatment, momentarily speechless. It was the first time Ethan had seen her vulnerable. "Why would you do that without guarantees?" she finally asked, her voice slightly lower. Ethan shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with his own gesture. "Let's say it's a vote of confidence and perhaps a form of balance. You sacrificed your career for your mother. That demonstrates character." "Thank you," said Sophie simply, touching the folder with almost reverent care. "But I prefer this to be part of the formal agreement. I don't want ambiguities or emotional debts." Ethan nodded, respecting her position. There was a dignity in Sophie's refusal to accept charity that deeply impressed him. During the next 2 hours, they reviewed every detail of the contract. Ethan was surprised by the analytical precision with which Sophie examined each clause, suggesting adjustments and clarifications with the competence of a corporate lawyer. Her intelligence was evident, as was her determination to protect her independence within the agreement. "We have a crucial point to discuss," said Ethan, after finalizing the financial aspects. "For the marriage to be considered valid under the will, we need to appear as a genuine couple. This means we'll have to build a convincing narrative about our relationship." "I understand," replied Sophie, pragmatic. "I suggest something simple and verifiable. We could say we met during an Eleanor Mitchell Foundation event a few months ago. I could have participated as a volunteer. It's a story few would question and would be difficult to disprove." "That could work," agreed Ethan. "But we still need to resolve the issue of cohabitation. The family lawyers will certainly investigate our relationship." Sophie considered for a moment. "We can maintain separate residences, but I need to spend enough time here to create evidence of cohabitation. Some belongings, established routines, knowledge about your personal habits." There was a methodical coldness in her approach that paradoxically reassured Ethan. It was like a commercial negotiation, without the weight of emotional expectations that always suffocated him in previous relationships. "Then," he said, extending his hand, "do we have an agreement?" Sophie hesitated for a brief moment, her gaze sweeping the luxurious apartment before returning to the man before her, a stranger with whom she was about to unite her life, at least on paper. "We have an agreement," she replied, shaking the offered hand. The touch was brief, professional, but something indefinable passed between them, a mutual recognition that, however rational the arrangement, they were about to embark on something deeply intimate and unpredictable. A week later, in a discreet ceremony at the courthouse, with only James Parker as a witness, Ethan Mitchell and Sophia Collins signed the documents that made them legally married. There were no elaborate vows, just the formal commitment before the law. When the justice of the peace declared they could kiss, they exchanged a chaste and quick kiss, the first and, presumably, the last. That same afternoon, while Ethan returned to an important meeting, Sophie visited her mother at the hospital to give the news of the start of the experimental treatment. Neither mentioned the marriage that had just taken place. It was an irrelevant detail in the face of the renewed hope in Martha Collins' eyes. The agreement was sealed. The contract of two completely different lives, now intertwined by necessity and convenience, officially began. What neither knew was that the logic that built that union would be its least important aspect in the months to come. The news of Ethan Mitchell's marriage exploded in the media like an unexpected bomb. Headlines speculated about the mysterious woman who had conquered the most coveted bachelor in the American market. Business analysts questioned the timing of the decision, while social columnists desperately tried to discover from which traditional family the new Mrs. Mitchell came. "It's impressive how no one can find information about her," commented James, leafing through the gossip magazines spread across Ethan's desk. "Your security department did an impeccable job cleaning up her digital history." Ethan observed the city through his office window. There wasn't much to clean. Sophie has always been discreet. The mention of the nickname didn't go unnoticed by James. It was the first time he had heard his friend refer to his wife with such familiarity. "How is the cohabitation?" he asked cautiously. Ethan turned around, an enigmatic smile on his face. "Surprisingly peaceful. Sophie is different." Different was an understatement. In the 2 weeks since the wedding, Ethan had discovered in Sophie a presence that was simultaneously discreet and transformative. She occupied minimal spaces in the spacious apartment, keeping her few belongings organized in a single cabinet. She rose before him, leaving fresh coffee and a daily note with practical observations about the agenda or useful reminders. At night, when he arrived exhausted, he found dinner prepared, nothing elaborate but tasty and comforting. They ate in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging observations about news or books. It wasn't a conventional marriage or even a friendship yet. It was a carefully rehearsed choreography of two people occupying the same space without invading each other's solitude. "The board is eager to meet her formally," commented James, interrupting his thoughts. "The Foundation's charity dinner is in 3 days. It will be her first official appearance." Ethan nodded. "She's prepared." Indeed, Sophie had meticulously dedicated herself to studying the corporate and social universe she now had to inhabit. She spent hours researching board members, their wives, the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation projects, and even the gastronomic and cultural preferences of potential interlocutors. Ethan often found her making notes in a small notebook, creating what she called a social map, a practical guide to navigate unknown waters. What he didn't know was that Sophie faced her own internal challenges. That afternoon, as she prepared for the charity dinner, she faced her reflection in the guest room mirror she occupied. "You can do this," she murmured to herself, adjusting the navy blue dress she had bought especially for the occasion. Simple, elegant, and within the tight budget she still maintained despite the new situation. She had refused to accept credit cards or access to Ethan's accounts beyond what was strictly agreed for her mother's treatment. The soft knock on the door startled her. "Can we talk?" asked Ethan from the other side. When she opened the door, Sophie found the businessman impeccably dressed in his tuxedo, holding a black velvet box. "I brought something for you to wear tomorrow," he said, extending the gift. "It belonged to my grandmother." Inside the box rested a set of sapphires and diamonds, a delicate necklace with matching earrings, elegant but not ostentatious jewels. "Ethan, this wasn't part of the agreement," protested Sophie, taking a step back. "It's not a personal gift," he explained, pragmatic. "It's a work tool. People will expect to see my wife wearing family jewels. It's part of the narrative we built." There was logic in the argument, but still Sophie hesitated before accepting the box. "Thank you. I'll take good care of them." "Sure you will," replied Ethan, observing her with curiosity. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Sophie considered lying, but opted for honesty. "I am. Your world is more intimidating for someone like me." "Like you?" "Without pedigree, without social training, without a last name that opens doors." Ethan smiled, a rare gesture that completely transformed his usually serious face. "You have something more valuable than all that. You have authenticity. Most people in that room would give anything to feel real for a day. The observation caught Sophie by surprise. It was the most personal comment he had ever made. Even so, continued Ethan, I prepared some cards with information about the main people who will be present. I thought it might help. He extended a small stack of meticulously organized cards. Each contained a name, photo, position, interests, and topics to avoid. You did this? Asked Sophie, genuinely surprised. I thought it would facilitate your social navigation, he replied simply. It's just a map of the terrain. Sophie smiled, recognizing in the cards the same methodical approach she herself used. Thank you. This helps a lot. The next evening, the Grand Hyatt New York gleamed with the country's business and political elite. The annual charity dinner of the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation was one of the most disputed events on the social calendar, combining genuine philanthropy with high-level networking opportunities. Ethan and Sophie arrived punctually at 8. She wore the navy blue dress, the Mitchell family sapphires discreetly shining on her neck. Her hair, normally tied in a practical bun, was loose in defined curls that framed her face. The transformation was subtle but effective. Not a different woman, just a more polished version of the same Sophie. Breathe, whispered Ethan, offering his arm as they entered the hall. You look beautiful and completely capable of winning over every person in this place. His confidence surprised and strengthened her. For a brief moment, she felt not like an imposter, but like a genuine partner. The first minutes were exactly as they had rehearsed. Ethan formally introduced her. She smiled and exchanged rehearsed pleasantries. The curious and occasionally critical looks didn't go unnoticed, but Sophie endured them with the silent dignity that had always been her trademark. It was during a conversation with the senator's wife that the first real challenge arose. The woman, visibly bothered by the presence of the stranger in the social circle she considered her territory, decided to test Sophie. So, dear, Ethan told me you met at a foundation event. Which project were you coordinating again? It was a trap. Ethan had never shared such a detail, and the woman was clearly trying to expose an inconsistency in the fabricated story. Sophie smiled serenely. Actually, I was a volunteer in the digital inclusion project in the Bronx. My role was quite modest. I taught elderly people to use computers to communicate with distant relatives. It was there that I realized how technology can build bridges between generations. The response, though fabricated in the moment, carried the tone of authenticity that came from Sophie's real experience with her own mother. Interesting, replied the woman, clearly disappointed at not having managed to unmask the newcomer. And before that, what did you do again? Ethan approached, ready to intervene, but Sophie responded naturally. I worked in various sectors while caring for my sick mother: cleaner, receptionist, administrative assistant. I believe knowing the reality of different jobs gave me a unique perspective on the value of dignity in any function. An uncomfortable silence followed the honest response. The senator's wife seemed genuinely shocked, not by the revelation itself, but by the frankness with which it was delivered. That's admirable, she finally responded, not knowing how to react to the absence of social pretension. Throughout the night, the pattern repeated itself. When questioned about her origin, education, or family connections, Sophie responded with direct simplicity, without shame or apology. Paradoxically, this raw honesty began to win admiration. In an environment where everyone hid something, transparency was a refreshing novelty. The turning point occurred during the charity auction. One of the coordinators approached Ethan in panic. The presenter who would conduct the auction had cancelled at the last minute due to a family emergency. What now? We have more than 300 people waiting and no one to conduct the bids, lamented the woman. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie intervened. I can help. I conducted small community auctions to raise funds for my mother's treatment. The principle is the same, only the scale changes. Ethan looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? Trust me, replied Sophie with a calm confidence. I know how to make people open their wallets for a good cause. And indeed she did. In the following 40 minutes, Sophie conducted the auction with a unique combination of humility and authority that captured the attention of the entire room. She knew each project benefited by the lots, explaining with genuine passion the real impact each donation would have. When a bid stagnated, she provoked the businessmen with intelligent humor and subtle challenges to the ego, exactly the type of stimulus that worked in that environment. In the end, the auction raised 38% more than the previous year. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Ethan later as they returned home in the car. "Observing people," replied Sophie simply. "When you spend your life being invisible, you learn a lot about how the visible function." Ethan studied her in the darkness of the car, seeing her in a completely new way. Sophie wasn't just a pragmatic solution to his problem. She was an extraordinary woman in her own right, whose potential had been suffocated by circumstances beyond her control. "You were incredible today," he finally said. "Thank you." Sophie smiled, allowing herself a rare moment of satisfaction. "Thank you for trusting me." When they arrived at the apartment, a new comfort hovered between them. Not intimacy exactly, but a mutual respect born from the recognition of qualities beyond the commercial agreement that had united them. Next day, the main newspapers and social magazines highlighted the new Mrs. Mitchell as the revelation of the night and a refreshing presence on the New York social scene. The photos showed an elegant woman in her simplicity, with a gleam of intelligence in her eyes that captured attention. Meanwhile, behind the scenes at Mitchell Innovations, something unexpected was happening. Employees who had never interacted directly with Ethan began to recognize in Sophie his new wife, the same woman who for years had cleaned their offices, brought coffee in moments of crisis, and offered gentle smiles in anonymous corridors. News spread quickly through the various departments. The new Mrs. Mitchell was one of us, an ordinary person who, by some miracle of fate, had crossed the invisible barrier between worlds. The impact was immediate and profound. The company, always admired for its efficiency, began to develop something new, a sense of community, an emotional identification with the leadership that had never existed before. Ethan, without fully understanding the origin of the change, perceived only its effects: more productive meetings, commitments fulfilled with renewed enthusiasm, innovative suggestions emerging from previously silent departments. "Something is different," he commented to James during an executive meeting. "The company seems more alive." James smiled, understanding what his friend had not yet realized. "It's the Sophie effect. You married someone who humanized your image. Suddenly, the feared Ethan Mitchell is no longer just the inaccessible genius on the top floor. He's the man who fell in love with a woman everyone knows and respects." "But our marriage is just an arrangement," protested Ethan in a low voice. James shrugged. "Maybe, but the impact is real, regardless of the origin. And honestly, I've never seen you more balanced than in the last few weeks." Ethan didn't respond. How could he explain that for the first time in years, he returned home not just to an empty space, but to a presence that didn't demand, didn't drain, didn't charge, just existed in harmony with his own solitude? What had begun as a commercial contract was slowly transforming into something neither of them had foreseen, a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and silent recognition of qualities rarely valued in the world they now shared. Victor. Reynolds' office on Fifth Avenue was a calculated display of power. Paintings by renowned artists adorned the walls, the furniture boasted imported noble woods, and the privileged view of the city seemed to reinforce his position above the common mortals. A former board member of Mitchell Innovations and current president of Reynolds Technologies, Victor had never gotten over being passed over by Ethan in the dispute for the company's presidency years ago. "So it's her," he said, observing the photos spread on his desk. Images of Sophie at different moments, leaving the building where she lived with her mother in Queens, working as a cleaner at Mitchell Tower, talking with Ethan at the Argonaut bookstore. From cleaner to Mrs. Mitchell, what a touching fairy tale. Renato Silva, the private investigator hired by Victor, remained silent. Accustomed to working for the business elite, he knew his role was to provide information, not opinions. What's the real story? Asked Victor, leaning forward. Old affair? Unexpected pregnancy? Blackmail? From what I could ascertain, there's none of that, replied Renato with professionalism. Her mother is really sick. She started an expensive experimental treatment coincidentally after the wedding. Her history is clean. Brilliant student who abandoned her academic career to care for her mother. No significant romantic involvements in recent years. Victor drummed his fingers on the desk, visibly displeased by the lack of evident scandals. Nobody goes from cleaning to marriage with a billionaire without some kind of negotiation. Well, I can't confirm that, admitted the investigator, but I discovered something interesting about Eleanor Mitchell's will. Victor's eyes shone with renewed interest as the investigator explained the marriage clause and the imminent deadline Ethan faced. As the explanation advanced, a calculating smile formed on his face. So our friend Ethan desperately needed a wife, and he found an employee in a vulnerable situation, needing money to save her mother. Victor laughed, satisfied. A marriage of convenience, classic and pathetic. What do you intend to do with this information? Asked the investigator, maintaining a neutral tone. The correct question, my dear, is what the financial market and Mitchell Innovations shareholders will do when they discover their brilliant CEO is defrauding his grandmother's will with a fake marriage. The next day, while Victor's plan began to take shape behind the scenes, Sophie was experiencing a silent transformation in her own life. After 3 months of marriage, she had found a surprising balance between her two worlds. In the morning, she visited her mother, now installed in an adapted apartment that Ethan had insisted on providing near the hospital, where she was undergoing treatment. Martha showed clear signs of improvement. Her mobility had increased, pains had diminished, and there was a renewed vivacity in her eyes. Daughter, tell me more about that foundation project you mentioned, asked Martha during breakfast, observing Sophie with barely disguised pride. In recent weeks, Sophie had begun to actively involve herself with the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation, contributing ideas for a new technological training program for women from underprivileged communities. Her personal experience and academic background formed a unique combination that brought valuable perspectives to projects previously conceived only by executives distant from social reality. It's amazing, Mum. We're creating a curriculum that combines technical skills with contextualized entrepreneurship. The women won't just learn programming, but how to develop solutions for real problems in their communities. And Ethan, how is your relationship? Asked Martha cautiously. She knew only the official version of the story, that her daughter had met the businessman during volunteer work and lived a discreet romance before the wedding. Sophie hesitated. How to explain something she herself didn't completely understand? The marriage of convenience had evolved into a partnership based on mutual respect and, surprisingly, moments of genuine connection. They shared quiet dinners, discussing books, worked together on foundation projects, and sometimes simply enjoyed each other's comfortable silence. It wasn't romantic love, but there was a growing intimacy that transcended the original agreement. We're good, she finally replied. It's different from what I imagined. The cell phone interrupted the conversation. It was Emily Foster, the young receptionist at Mitchell Innovations, with whom Sophie had developed an unlikely friendship. Years before, when she still worked as a cleaner, Sophie had noticed Emily's talent for design when seeing her drawing during breaks. She had begun to discreetly encourage her, lending books and suggesting online courses. Now, even after her change in status, she maintained the informal mentorship. Sophie, have you seen the news? Asked Emily, her voice clearly agitated. What news? It's in all the financial portals. Someone leaked information about Eleanor's will and is insinuating that your marriage to Ethan is a fraud. Sophie's heart accelerated. She quickly said goodbye to her mother and in the taxi heading to the apartment frantically checked the news sites. The headlines were devastating. Wedding of the Year or Billion-Dollar Fraud. Mitchell Innovations, CEO under suspicion. Cleaner. Becomes billionaire's wife. Love or financial agreement. Controversial will Ethan Mitchell's race against time. A particularly malicious article included photos of her working as a cleaner with the caption, "From mop to ring, the meteoric rise of Sophia Collins." When she arrived at the apartment, she found Ethan in a tense video conference with the board of directors. His normally composed face showed clear signs of tension. Seeing her, he gestured for her to wait and continued the conversation. "Gentlemen, my personal life is not on the agenda," he was saying with controlled firmness. "The company's performance remains exceptional, with 17% growth in the last quarter. I suggest we focus on the relevant facts." "Ethan, understand our position," replied one of the board members. "The stocks fell 8% just this morning. Investors are concerned about the stability of leadership and the legitimacy of shareholder control. We need guarantees. And you'll have them. My lawyers are already preparing an official statement." With that, he ended the meeting. When he finally turned to Sophie, there was a mixture of anger and concern in his eyes. "Someone investigated us. They know specific details about the will and how we met." "Victor Reynolds," suggested Sophie. During the months of cohabitation, she had become deeply familiar with the corporate power games surrounding Ethan. "Probably. He has the motive and the resources." Ethan ran his hand through his hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "The problem is that we need an immediate strategy. The company's ethics committee is demanding a formal investigation into the legitimacy of our marriage." "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means we'll need to prove our relationship is genuine, separate. Interviews, cohabitation verification, detailed history." Sophie's stomach sank. The carefully constructed agreement was about to collapse under public scrutiny. "There's something else," continued Ethan, his voice suddenly softer. "I received this an hour ago." He extended his cell phone, showing an anonymous message. "Your wife was approached by a private investigator 2 weeks ago. They offered $500,000 to confirm the farce. She refused. Did you know that?" Sophie paled. It was true. A man had approached her when she was leaving the hospital after visiting her mother, offering money in exchange for a confession about the nature of the marriage. She had immediately refused and hadn't told Ethan, fearing to appear weak or opportunistic by mentioning a bribery attempt she had rejected. "Why didn't you tell me?" asked Ethan, the disappointment evident in his voice. "I resolved it alone. I didn't think it was relevant." "Relevant?" His voice rose slightly. "We're under attack, Sophie. Any information is relevant. We could have prepared, neutralized the threat before it exploded." "I'm not used to sharing my problems," she replied with dignity. "I've always solved everything alone." Ethan observed her for a long moment, as if seeing her in a new light. "That's the point, isn't it? We're not really in this together. We continue to be two people with a contract, not partners." The words hit Sophie with unexpected force. There was truth in them, a truth that hurt more than it should for someone in a purely contractual relationship. Before she could respond, Ethan's phone rang again. It was James Parker with even worse news. "Ethan, the situation has worsened. Someone is circulating a supposed copy of your prenuptial agreement among board members. It's fake, obviously, but very convincing. It details specific payments, public appearance clauses, even scripts for social interactions." Sophie could hear the alarmed voice through the speakerphone. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed about to burst from her chest. "And there's more," continued James. "The committee has scheduled a formal hearing for 3 days from now. You'll both be interrogated separately about the details of the relationship." When the call ended, a heavy silence settled between them. The meticulously constructed agreement, the partnership that had worked perfectly for 3 months, now faced its first real crisis. "What will we do?" Sophie finally asked. Ethan straightened his shoulders, reassuming his strategist posture. "What we always do, we adapt. We need to know all the details about each other, not just the obvious ones, but small intimacies that only a genuine couple would share." "Like what?" "Like the fact that you always put cinnamon in your morning coffee, but never in the afternoons. Like I always leave a light on in the hallway, because I have an irrational fear of complete darkness. Like you sing Aretha Franklin's song softly when you're concentrating. Like I always check 3 times if the door is locked before sleeping. Sophie stared at him, surprised not only by the precise observations about her habits, but by the fact that Ethan had noticed them. She realized with an internal jolt that for months they had been observing each other with much more attention than they admitted. "We have 3 days," continued Ethan, checking his watch. "I suggest we start right now." In the following 72 hours, they developed an intimacy forced by circumstances. They shared childhood stories, secret fears, abandoned dreams. Ethan talked about the absence of his parents, always too busy with their own careers to raise a child. Sophie revealed her father's abandonment and the difficulties she faced as a scholarship student at an elite school where she was constantly reminded of her humble origin. It was strange, reflected Sophie, how the external threat had broken barriers. That months of cohabitation hadn't managed to tear down. In 3 days, they learned more about each other than in all the previous time. On the morning of the hearing, as they prepared in silence in the apartment, Sophie's phone rang. It was the hospital. Martha had suffered a serious crisis during the night and was in the ICU. They needed her presence immediately for decisions about the treatment. Sophie's face lost all color. "My mother, she..." Ethan grabbed the car keys instantly. "Let's go to the hospital right now." "But the hearing, the committee..." "Your mother is more important. I can deal with the committee alone." "I can't let you face this alone," protested Sophie, torn between 2 impossible loyalties. Ethan gently held her shoulders. "Sophie, listen. What we have is an agreement, but what you have with your mother is true love. I would never ask you to choose a legal document over that." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, the first Ethan had ever seen from her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. As Ethan drove her to the hospital, driving with silent concentration through New York's congested streets, something fundamental changed between them. What had begun as a cold commercial contract had evolved into a respectful partnership, and now there was something more. Something neither had foreseen or sought, but which grew silently, like a stubborn plant finding its way between the cracks of a concrete wall. Later, while Sophie kept vigil at her mother's hospital bedside, Ethan faced the Mitchell Innovations Ethics Committee alone, defending not only his control of the company, but something that had become unexpectedly more important: the dignity of a woman who had entered his life out of necessity, but remained for a completely different reason. The meeting room on the 50th floor of Mitchell Tower had been transformed into a kind of informal tribunal. On one side of the mahogany oval table, 5 members of the Ethics Committee, all senior executives with decades of corporate experience. On the other, Ethan Mitchell, alone for the first time in a situation that would normally count with a team of lawyers and advisors. "Where is your wife, Mr. Mitchell?" asked Margaret Wilson, the committee president, a 60-year-old woman known for her ethical inflexibility. "At the hospital. Her mother had a medical emergency this morning," replied Ethan with studied calm. "Quite convenient," commented Richard Thompson, another committee member, with evident skepticism. Ethan maintained a firm gaze. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Collins's illness is an invention, Dr. Thompson? I can provide the complete medical records if necessary." The man retreated slightly, realizing he had crossed a line. "No, of course not. I merely observed the coincidence." "There is no coincidence," replied Ethan. "There is a seriously ill woman and a daughter who abandoned a promising career to care for her. If this interferes with our corporate agenda, I apologize, but some priorities are non-negotiable." Something in the firmness of his response surprised those present. The Ethan Mitchell they knew was pragmatic to the point of coldness, always, prioritizing business results above emotional considerations. "Well, we'll have to proceed without her," decided Margaret. "As you know, Mr. Mitchell, serious allegations have emerged about the nature of your marriage to Sophia Collins, specifically that it would be a contractual arrangement solely intended to satisfy the clause in your grandmother's will." "I am aware," he replied, maintaining his composure. Do you deny these allegations? Categorically. Margaret nodded, as if the response was exactly what she expected. I understand. We've prepared some questions to verify the authenticity of the relationship. For the next 2 hours, Ethan faced a meticulous interrogation, questions about how they had met, details of domestic routine, Sophie's personal preferences, from her favorite food to her political opinions. To his own surprise, he knew the answers to most of them, not because they had rehearsed, but because he had really been paying attention. She prefers chamomile tea at night, but strong coffee in the morning, always with a spoonful of brown, sugar and cinnamon. Her current bedside book is Sapiens by Yuval Harari. She disagrees with several points, especially about technological determinism. She has an allergy to seafood and moderate lactose intolerance. With each response, he realized how he had absorbed small details about Sophie during the months of cohabitation. They weren't information studied for a test, but observations collected naturally, almost without realizing. "Impressive, Mr. Mitchell," commented Margaret after a particularly detailed series of responses. "You seem to know your wife well." "I do," he replied simply. "However," intervened another committee member, "this doesn't explain how a cleaning staff employee suddenly became your wife without any documented previous relationship." Ethan sighed. "Have you ever fallen in love, Dr. Bennett? It's rarely documented or follows an approved corporate timeline." The comment provoked some discreet smiles around the table. Even so, the committee persisted. "We received detailed information about an alleged financial agreement," continued Margaret, "including specific payments for Sophia's mother's medical treatments." "Yes, I pay for my mother-in-law's medical treatments," confirmed Ethan without hesitation, "just as I pay for the health insurance of all employees of this company and their direct dependents. It's my responsibility as a husband and as a human being." And the treatment coincidentally began right after the wedding. Ethan leaned forward, his patience visibly running out. "Let me clarify something, Dr. Wilson. When I met Sophie, she was working 2 jobs to support her sick mother. A woman with brilliant academic training reduced to functions far below her capacity due to circumstances she didn't choose. Yes, I pay for the treatment. Yes, that began after our marriage. But the implication that she married me for money is not only offensive to her, but demonstrates a limited understanding of the character of the woman I chose as my wife." The silence that followed his passionate declaration was palpable. Ethan realized with some astonishment that every word he had uttered was true, not a fabricated defense, but a genuine expression of admiration for Sophie. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret finally said, "we appreciate your frankness. However, this committee has the responsibility to ensure that the interests of the company and shareholders are protected. If your majority control is based on a questionable representation of your personal situation, this becomes a matter of corporate governance." "I fully understand," replied Ethan, "and I respect the function of this committee. But allow me to ask a question. What exactly is the concern? That I lose control of the company if my marriage is invalidated, or that I maintain control through a relationship that you consider inadequate?" The direct question left the committee momentarily without an answer. It was Richard Thompson who finally replied, "Both possibilities are concerning, Mr. Mitchell. Instability in leadership affects market confidence, and leadership based on artifices raises significant ethical questions." Ethan nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of the concern. "I understand. In that case, I suggest you talk to my wife when she can be present. I believe she can clarify any doubt about the nature of our relationship." The meeting ended without a definitive resolution. The committee agreed to reconvene when Sophie could be present. Meanwhile, Mitchell Innovations would face days of uncertainty and speculation in the market. Upon leaving the building, Ethan drove directly to the hospital. He found Sophie in the ICU corridor, her face marked by fatigue and concern. Seeing him, something in her expression momentarily softened. "How is she?" asked Ethan, gently touching her shoulder. "Stable," replied Sophie. "The doctor says the worst has passed, but she'll still need to stay hospitalized for a few days." "And you? How are you?" Sophie shook her head, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. Exhausted, scared, I feel divided between two worlds that are simultaneously crumbling. Ethan led her to the small hospital cafeteria, where they could talk with some privacy. He told her about the meeting with the committee, the questions, the suspicions. "They want to speak with you when you're available," he concluded, "but only when your mother is better." Sophie studied him with attentive eyes. "How was it, really?" "It was enlightening," replied Ethan after a moment of reflection. "I realized how much I really know about you, and how much I still don't know." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. "Ethan," Sophie finally said, "if the committee decides our marriage isn't valid for the purposes of the will, what happens?" The question hovered between them, loaded with implications not only for Ethan's business empire, but for the relationship they had built. A relationship that had begun as a cold transaction and evolved into something neither knew exactly how to name. "Legally, I'll lose majority control of the company and a significant part of the inheritance," he replied honestly. "The foundation projects will probably suffer cuts, and you—" "I'll lose my mother's treatment," completed Sophie with the frankness that had always characterized her. "No," corrected Ethan immediately. "Your mother's treatment will continue regardless of what happens with the company or our agreement. That's non-negotiable." Sophie looked at him, surprised. "Why? Without the contract, without the need to maintain appearances, what would be your motive?" Ethan hesitated, the words caught in his throat. How to explain something he himself was only beginning to understand? How to name the respect that had transformed into admiration, the convenience that had become connection, the agreement that had evolved into something much more complex than a simple contract? "Because some things transcend contracts," he finally replied. "Because your mother deserves the best possible treatment. And because you, Sophia Collins, deserve much more than life has offered you so far." Unexpected tears shone in Sophie's eyes, the woman who had faced so many adversities without ever showing weakness. With an impulsive gesture, she covered Ethan's hand with hers. "Thank you," she said simply. 2 days later, with Martha already out of danger and transferred to a private room, Sophie attended the ethics committee's reconvening. Ethan had insisted on not being present. He wanted her to speak freely, without feeling observed or pressured by his presence. The meeting room was exactly as before. 5 executives on one side of the table, now with Sophie alone on the other side. She wore simple but elegant clothes, black dress pants and a white shirt. No jewelry beyond her wedding ring and the small jade necklace she rarely removed. "Mrs. Mitchell," began Margaret, "we appreciate your presence, especially considering your mother's situation." "I prefer to be called Sophia or Ms. Collins," she gently corrected. "I maintain my name by personal choice." The small affirmation of identity didn't go unnoticed by the committee. It wasn't the behavior expected from someone who would have married for social status. "Very well, Ms. Collins. We're here to discuss the nature of your relationship with Ethan Mitchell, specifically responding to allegations that your marriage would be a contractual agreement solely intended to meet the clause in Eleanor Mitchell's will." Sophie nodded, maintaining her composure. "I understand. Do you deny these allegations?" Sophie took a deep breath. Throughout her life, she had faced challenges with brutal honesty. It was her method of survival, her armor. Even now, with so much at stake, she couldn't abandon this fundamental principle. "What I can say about my marriage to Ethan is that it began in an unusual way, but evolved into something neither of us planned or foresaw." The carefully balanced response made Margaret frown. "That doesn't directly answer the question, Ms. Collins." "Because the question presumes a simplicity that doesn't exist in real human relationships, Dr. Wilson. People marry for numerous reasons: love, companionship, financial stability, family pressure, fear of loneliness. Often for a combination of all these factors. Which part of these motivations makes a marriage real or fraudulent?" The philosophical response caught the committee by surprise. They expected vehement denials or cornered confessions, not an existential reflection on the nature of relationships. Let's be more direct then, intervened Richard Thompson. Did you marry Ethan Mitchell for money for your mother's treatment? Sophie maintained a firm gaze. My mother is alive today thanks to the treatment she received after my marriage to Ethan. That's a fact. It's also a fact that I work every day to be a partner who adds value to his life, not just socially but intellectually and emotionally. If that makes our marriage less legitimate than unions based on passing physical attraction or social convenience, I leave it to the committee to judge. For 2 hours, Sophie faced detailed questions about her life with Ethan. Unlike him, she didn't respond with direct factual information, but with surprisingly intimate observations. Ethan keeps a light on in the hallway at night because he has a secret fear of complete darkness, childhood trauma when he stayed alone in the mansion while his parents constantly traveled. He prefers the left side of the bed because he sleeps facing the window. He says he likes to see the city lights when he wakes in the middle of the night. It reminds him he's not alone in the world. When he's truly concentrated on a problem, Ethan drums his fingers in patterns of 3. It's a tic he tries to control in public, but that happens naturally when he's comfortable. Detail after detail that revealed not just superficial knowledge but deep and attentive observation. They weren't information memorized by contract, but small intimacies discovered in daily cohabitation. The crucial moment came when Margaret, clearly impressed but still skeptical, asked the most direct question. Ms. Collins, be completely honest, do you love Ethan Mitchell? The silence that followed was heavy. Sophie looked out the window for a long moment, observing New York extending to the horizon, the city that had been the stage for her struggles, defeats, and unexpectedly, her transformation. When I agreed to marry Ethan, she began slowly. It was a practical agreement between 2 people with complementary needs. I needed resources to save my mother. He needed a wife to maintain his company. It was simple, clean, objective. She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. What I didn't foresee was how it would be to share life with someone as complex as him. Ethan projects an image of coldness and absolute control, but at home I see a man who leaves the bathroom door open while brushing his teeth to be able to continue a conversation about Russian literature. A man who, despite all his wealth, was genuinely moved when I prepared the cornbread my grandmother used to make, because no one had cooked specifically for him in years. Her voice gained a subtle intensity as she continued. I didn't expect to discover someone who cares so deeply about his social projects, not for corporate image, but because he truly believes in transformation through education. I didn't expect to find an intellectual partner who challenges my ideas and respects my intelligence, even when we disagree. And I certainly didn't expect to realize that behind the powerful billionaire, there is a man as lonely as I've always been, just in a much larger apartment. She looked directly at Margaret, her eyes shining with a quiet certainty. So, to answer your question, what I feel for Ethan transcended the initial terms of our agreement long ago. If this is love in the conventional sense that society celebrates in movies and songs, I can't say. But I know that my life is better with him in it, and I sincerely hope that his is also better with me. And if that isn't the essence of what a marriage should be, then perhaps we're all pursuing the wrong definitions. The silence that followed her declaration was almost reverent. There was an undeniable authenticity in her words, not rehearsed, not calculated, but deeply felt. After some final questions, the committee thanked her for her presence and informed her they would deliberate the decision. Sophie left the room with the same silent dignity with which she had entered, not knowing if she had saved Ethan's business empire or sealed his fate with too much honesty. In the corridor, to her surprise, she found Emily Foster anxiously waiting. "Sophie, how was it? Everyone in the company is talking about it." "I don't know," she replied honestly. "I told the truth. It's not always enough, but it's all I have to offer." Emily hugged her impulsively. "You're amazing, you know. Since I met you cleaning those corridors, I always knew there was something special about you. Now everyone can see it." Sophie smiled, genuinely touched by the support from the young woman she had helped years ago and who had now become a true friend. "How's the design course going?" she asked, changing the subject. Emily's eyes shone. Amazing, I'm developing a project for the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation, a visual platform for teaching programming to children. It was inspired by you, you know, in how you always explained complex things in a way anyone could understand. The pride Sophie felt at that moment was different from anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't for herself, but for the potential she had helped awaken in another person, a silent legacy that transcended her own journey. Later that night, when she finally arrived at the hospital to visit her mother, she found Ethan already there, calmly conversing with Martha. The scene, so domestic, so natural, caught her completely off guard. "Oh, daughter, good you're here," exclaimed Martha, visibly stronger than in previous days. "Ethan was telling me about that park in the Hamptons we visited on our wedding anniversary. We need to go there when I get out of here." Sophie looked at Ethan, confused. They had never celebrated a wedding anniversary, much less in the Hamptons. He returned the look with an almost imperceptible shrug and a complicit smile. "Of course, Mom," she replied, entering the game without questioning. "When you're recovered." Later, as they walked through the hospital parking lot, Sophie finally asked, "The Hamptons?" Ethan smiled. "Your mother mentioned she always dreamed of going but never had the opportunity. I thought it would be a good recovery gift and a good cover story for our arrangement." Sophie stopped walking, studying the man before her, with new eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied simply. "I wanted to." That night, upon returning to the apartment they shared, Sophie realized that something fundamental had changed. The agreement that had begun as a cold transaction between strangers was now rooted in something much deeper, something that didn't yet have a name, but that grew silently between the fissures of their carefully compartmentalized lives. 3 days later, the ethics committee issued its decision. Ethan and Sophie's marriage would be considered legitimate for the purposes of Eleanor Mitchell's will. The shareholder control was secure, the social projects preserved, the future apparently stabilized. But for Sophie and Ethan, a new uncertainty had emerged, not about contracts or legal clauses, but about real feelings that no agreement had foreseen and that neither knew exactly how to manage. The New York spring brought unexpected colors to the usually gray city. In the garden of the nursing home in Greenwich Village, where Martha was now recovering, jasmines and magnolias bloomed, perfuming the air with promises of renewal. Seated on a bench under the generous shade of a tree, Sophie observed her mother walking slowly across the lawn, supported by a cane but with increasingly firm steps. 6 months had passed since the crisis that had almost taken Martha. 6 months since the ethics committee interrogation, 6 months of a routine that had established itself with surprising naturalness between her and Ethan. "She's much better," commented Emily, seated beside her. The young woman visited Martha regularly, having developed a genuine affection for the lady who treated her like an adopted daughter. "The doctor said she can have final discharge in 2 weeks," replied Sophie, a serene smile illuminating her face. "She'll be able to live at home again with weekly visits from the nurse." "And where will home be?" asked Emily carefully. "Will you return to Queens with her, or—" The question hovered in the air, loaded with implications. In recent months, the line between the commercial agreement and real life had become increasingly thin. Ethan and Sophie now functioned as a genuine couple in many aspects. They shared meals, discussed books, worked together on Eleanor Mitchell Foundation projects, and occasionally even watched movies side by side on the spacious living room couch. However, they maintained separate bedrooms and had never discussed the future beyond the deadline stipulated in the original contract. "We haven't decided yet," replied Sophie honestly. "There are many variables to consider." Emily nodded, understanding. As a close confidant, she was one of the few people who knew the truth about the beginning of the relationship, though she suspected the current situation was much more complex than the original agreement. "Speaking of decisions," she said, changing the subject, "I received an amazing proposal this morning. Remember the educational design project I developed for the foundation? Our UNESCO wants to implement an expanded version in schools across 5 Latin American countries." "AIM, that's wonderful," exclaimed Sophie, genuinely happy for her friend's success. "When does it start?" That's the point, replied Emily, suddenly serious. They want me to coordinate the implementation from the office in Chicago. It would be a complete change with an initial 2-year contract. You should accept, said Sophie without hesitation. It's the opportunity you deserve. But what about you and our joint project for the foundation? Sophie smiled, gently touching her friend's arm. Emily, remember when we met? You were a receptionist drawing logos hidden during breaks. Now, UNESCO wants your talent. Some opportunities are windows that open only once. You have to go through this one. There was a quiet wisdom in Sophie's words, as if she were speaking not only to her friend, but also to herself. That night, upon returning to the apartment, she found Ethan on the balcony, contemplating the New York horizon with a glass of wine. In recent months, he had developed the habit of waiting for her, even when late meetings kept him at the office. There was always a covered plate in the oven, an open bottle of wine breathing, small gestures that built a comfortable routine. How is Martha? He asked, pouring a glass for her. Getting better every day, replied Sophie, accepting the wine and joining him in contemplating the city. The doctor talks about final discharge in 2 weeks. Ethan nodded, absorbing the information. We could adapt the guest room on the other side of the hallway for her if you prefer to have her closer, or perhaps the apartment on the lower floor. That's vacant. It would give her privacy, but she would be close for care. The ease with which he incorporated her mother into future plans caught Sophie by surprise. It was one of the many moments when the original agreement seemed a distant memory, replaced by something much more organic and natural. Emily received a proposal from UNESCO, she commented, changing the subject, to implement her educational design project in 5 countries. I saw her project, replied Ethan with genuine respect. It's revolutionary in the visual approach to complex concepts. The international interest doesn't surprise me. She'll need to move to Chicago. Ethan observed her attentively. And that saddens you. It wasn't a question, but a precise observation of the subtle melancholy in her voice. In the months of cohabitation, they had developed an almost intuitive ability to read each other's emotional states. I'll miss her, admitted Sophie. But mainly I'm proud. Emily found her path, her purpose. Like you found yours in the foundation, observed Ethan. It was true. In recent months, Sophie had gradually assumed an increasingly significant role in the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation. She had begun as an informal consultant, offering perspectives on the real needs of the communities served, but her analytical intelligence and background in anthropology soon made her indispensable. Now she officially coordinated the digital inclusion program for underprivileged women, transforming lives with the same silent determination that had always characterized her. Ethan, said Sophie after a moment of comfortable silence, we need to talk about the future. He faced her, his face suddenly serious. The contract? Yes, the original deadline ends in 3 weeks. The contract they had signed stipulated a year of marriage, enough time to ensure the validation of the will and the security of shareholder control. The agreement included a reassessment clause at the end of that period, with the option of amicable divorce and adequate financial compensation for Sophie. What do you want, Sophie? Asked Ethan, using the nickname that had become natural on T. His lips. The question was simple, but the answer infinitely complex. What did she want? To continue in the comfortable life they had built together? To return to the total independence she had always valued? How to separate what had been born as practical necessity from what she now felt as emotional choice? I don't know, she replied honestly. Much has changed since we signed that paper. Ethan nodded, understanding. For me too. More words hovered between them, not spoken, but present like the perfume of the jasmines Sophie cultivated on the balcony, feelings that had grown organically, transcending the original agreement, but that neither knew exactly how to name or approach. I have a proposal, Ethan finally said. The foundation is expanding its international operations. We're starting a pilot project in partnership with UN Women to replicate our technological training model in Latin American countries. We need someone to coordinate the implementation from the office in Geneva, Switzerland. Sophie raised her eyebrows, surprised. And you're offering me this position? I'm not offering, corrected Ethan. The Foundation's board voted unanimously for you, based exclusively on your performance in the last 6 months. I abstained precisely to avoid any appearance of favoritism. Geneva, repeated Sophie, absorbing the magnitude of the opportunity. When would it start? In a month. Initial 2-year contract with possibility of extension. The implication was clear. After the end of the marriage contract, Sophie would have a legitimate and prestigious professional opportunity, completely separate from Ethan and the dynamic they had established. A chance to start over on her own terms, with total independence. It's an extraordinary opportunity, she commented, conflicting emotions in her chest. Pride for the professional recognition, excitement for the international perspective, but also an unexpected pang of sadness for the implicit separation. You deserve it, replied Ethan simply. Your vision transformed the Foundation's approach. You brought humanity to programs that were efficient before, but impersonal. I need to think, Sophie finally said. There's my mother to consider, and us, completed Ethan, verbalizing what both avoided. Sophie faced him, seeking words to express the complexity of what she felt. How to explain that what had begun as a cold commercial agreement had transformed into a partnership she deeply valued. How to admit that the prospect of returning to her previous life, even with independence and professional recognition, now seemed strangely empty. Yes, she replied simply. Us. Ethan took a step in her direction, diminishing the physical distance they always carefully maintained. Sophie, regardless of what you decide about Geneva, I want you to know that the last months have changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. The vulnerability in his voice, so rare in the always controlled man, touched Sophie deeply. For me too, she admitted, but I'm afraid of confusing gratitude with other feelings. I understand that fear, he replied. I feel it too. That's why the opportunity in Geneva is important. It gives you a completely free choice, without pressures or obligations. His cell phone vibrated, interrupting the moment. It was a message from the hospital. Nothing serious, just a reminder about Martha's appointment the next day, but enough to break the intensity of the conversation. We need to sleep, said Sophie, taking a step back. Tomorrow will be a long day. Ethan nodded, respecting as always her space. Good night, Sophie. Good night, Ethan. In the days that followed, Sophie pondered deeply about the decision she needed to make. She visited the Foundation's space in New York, talked at length with her mother, walked alone through the streets of the city that had always been her home, seeking clarity. 1 week before the official end of the contract, she made her final decision. The opportunity in Geneva represented everything she had always valued: independence, professional recognition, chance for global impact. Her mother, now recovered, could accompany her or remain in the United States in comfortable conditions. It was the logical choice, the path that the old Sophie, the practical and objective woman who had proposed the original agreement, would certainly take without hesitation. She formally communicated her decision to the Foundation's board and began preparations for the international move. Ethan, upon learning of her choice, offered complete logistical support, but maintained a careful emotional distance, as if understanding that this was a moment when she needed to act completely by her own convictions. On the eve of her departure, for Geneva, after a small farewell ceremony at the Foundation, Sophie returned to the apartment to finalize her packing. She found it empty. Ethan was at an important meeting out of town and would return only late at night. On the living room table, she found an envelope with her name written in the elegant and precise handwriting she knew well. Inside, not her check or legal documents as she might have expected, but a handwritten letter. Sophie, when you proposed our agreement a year ago, you thought you were offering a practical solution to my problem. What I didn't realize then, what neither of us could foresee, is that you were in fact offering much more. A chance to rediscover humanity in a world that I had reduced to numbers and strategies. In the months we spent together, I learned more about genuine connection than in all my previous life. I learned that true strength isn't in control or power, But in the courageous vulnerability you demonstrate daily, I learned that intelligence without empathy is empty, and that success without purpose is just an elaborate distraction from loneliness. You deserve the opportunity in Geneva. You deserve recognition for your brilliance, your vision, your unique ability to transform ideas into real impact. The world needs what you have to offer, and it would be selfish of me to want to keep you in a life less expansive than your potential. Our contract officially ends tomorrow. As agreed, all financial provisions have been implemented. Your economic independence is guaranteed, as is your mother's continued well-being. Legally, we're even. But there's something no contract could foresee or regulate. The fact that, throughout this year, I fell in love with the extraordinary woman you are, not for convenience, not for the solution you represented, but for your brilliant mind, your brave heart, your unshakable integrity. I don't write this as an attempt to influence your decision or create emotional obligations. I write only because you deserve to know the truth before departing. What began as a commercial agreement has transformed for me into the most authentic connection I've ever experienced. If your path is truly Geneva, and there are excellent reasons why it should, I'll part with a heavy heart but deeply grateful for the shared time. If, on the other hand, there is space in your plans for us to explore what we built together, without contracts or obligations, just as two people freely choosing to share life, I'll be waiting. Whatever your decision, know that you've transformed my life forever. With admiration and affection, Ethan. Sophie read the letter 3 times, silent tears running down her face. Words that expressed exactly what she herself felt, but hadn't been able to articulate. The gradual transformation of a practical agreement into a deep and authentic connection. She spent the night awake, reflecting on her life, her choices, the paths that had brought her to this point. The next morning, with her bags packed by the door, she made her final decision. She left an envelope on the table. Not a response to Ethan's letter, but something much more significant. 3 weeks later, the main hall of the European UN headquarters in Geneva was full for the launch ceremony of the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation's international program. Representatives from governments, non-governmental organizations and technology companies awaited the presentation from the coordinator who would implement the ambitious digital inclusion project for women in vulnerable situations. Sophia Collins took the stage with the same serene dignity that had always characterized her, now amplified by the confidence of someone who had found her true place in the world. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue suit, the small jade necklace, her only concession to sentimentality, discreetly shining on her neck. "It is with immense honor that I begin this transformative journey today," she began, her clear voice immediately capturing the attention of the international audience. What we began as a local project in American communities now has the opportunity to impact lives on a global scale. For 30 minutes, she brilliantly presented the vision, methodology, and goals of the program. She spoke about dignity, economic empowerment, and the revolutionary potential of technology when accessible to all. Her presentation combined precise data with touching human stories, exactly the approach that had transformed the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation under her influence. The end, as the audience applauded standing, Sophie noticed a discreet movement at the back of the auditorium. A familiar figure was silently entering, positioning himself against the wall. Ethan, with the same look of admiration he reserved for her moments of private brilliance, now witnessing her public triumph. "Before closing," said Sophie, retaking the microphone after the applause, "I would like to highlight that this project wouldn't be possible without the vision of the Eleanor Mitchell Foundation and its commitment to authentic social transformation, and especially without the leadership of someone who taught me that true power is in elevating others, not in controlling them." Her eyes met Ethan's at the back of the room, a look loaded with shared meaning, common history, conscious choices. "Therefore, I would like to invite to the stage the president of the foundation and CEO of Mitchell Innovations, Ethan Mitchell. for a few words. The audience applauded again as Ethan walked to the stage. As he passed Sophie, their fingers briefly touched, a small but intimate gesture. "Thank you, Dr. Collins," he said, taking the microphone with characteristic confidence, but a new warmth in his voice. "It's inspiring to see this project gain international dimension under your exceptional leadership." As Ethan spoke about the Foundation's continued commitment, Sophie observed the man she had met as a cold and distant CEO, transformed by the journey they had shared. The man who 3 weeks earlier had found on his table not a farewell letter, but the transfer documents for her apartment in Geneva, modified to include 2 occupants, not 1. The man who, upon meeting her at the Geneva airport days later, brought only a small suitcase and the simple question, "Are you sure?" To which she had replied with equal simplicity, "I've never been so sure of a choice in my entire life." At the end of the ceremony, as they conversed with diplomats and representatives of partner organizations, Emily, now Educational Design, director at the Foundation, approached discreetly. "You two are impressive together," she commented with a complicit smile. "Who would have thought, huh? From the cleaning room to the UN." Sophie smiled, observing Ethan across the room. "Life rarely follows predetermined contracts, Em. Sometimes the most unexpected detours lead us exactly where we should be." Later, walking along the shores of Lake Geneva, Ethan and Sophie contemplated the reflection of the mountains in the crystalline waters. No longer CEO and employee, no longer billionaire and woman in need, no longer contractor and contracted, just a man and a woman who had chosen freely to build a shared life. "You know what impresses me most?" asked Ethan, intertwining his fingers with hers. "How something that began so calculated, so rational, could evolve into something so real," completed Sophie. "Exactly real." Sophie smiled, thinking of the unlikely journey that had brought them here, from the practical proposal in a bookstore in downtown New York to the genuine partnership on the shores of a Swiss lake. From the contract signed in a courthouse to the free choice made with the heart. Perhaps because deep down what we seek in contracts is just an attempt to organize the chaos of life, she reflected. But real life happens in the margins, in the unregulated spaces, in the possibilities that no document can foresee. Ethan gently pulled her closer, the familiar scent of jasmine in her hair, bringing the feeling of home, even thousands of miles from where they began. "So, Mrs. Collins Mitchell, where do we go now?" he asked, using the hyphenated name she had finally accepted, not as submission to conventions, but as a symbol of the union of seemingly incompatible worlds. Sophie looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set over the Alpine mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that rivaled the most beautiful New York sunsets. "To the future we choose to build," she replied simply. "Together." And so as the lights of Geneva began to dot the historic city, 2 Americans who had crossed oceans, geographical and emotional, walked side by side. Their steps synchronized not by obligation or necessity, but by the conscious choice of 2 people who discovered, in the most unexpected of encounters, that true love is not an accident of fate, but a courageous decision renewed each day. Dear listeners, we hope that Sophie and Ethan's journey has touched your hearts. To continue exploring equally moving and captivating American stories, we've prepared a special playlist that you'll find by clicking on the link to the left of the screen. If this narrative of love and transformation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and share your thoughts in the comments. Every day we bring new stories that celebrate the complexity of life and human relationships. What did you think of Sophie's journey, from cleaning to international